Good afternoon, Allison. Welcome to the show.
Hey,
Great to have you here. So,
thanks for having me.
so folks, we have Allison Giddens from WinTech near Atlanta, Georgia, on the show today. Super excited to hear your background. I've been kind of watching you on LinkedIn from afar, talking about CMMC and all sorts of things shop related. I love some of the writings you've done. So let's dig in and learn more about you and WinTech.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat about this stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I've been with WinTech, I think 17 years now.
Mhm.
My background, I I come from an undergraduate degree of psychology and criminal justice,
Oh,
so
wow.
it really has nothing to do with manufacturing. But I had entered kind of a sales and marketing role with a large corporation right out of college, and a couple years into it, I was liking what I was doing, but I could tell like big corporation just wasn't really my thing. It wasn't where I belonged. So I called
Totally.
my dad and I said, I want to quit my job. And he said, you can't quit your job until you find a new one. The typical dad thing, right?
Yeah.
So I called my neighbor who I had pet sat for, and I said, I want to come work for you. And he said, you don't even know what I do. I said, I don't care what you do. I just have to find a new job before I quit my other one. So he let me come in for an interview, and
And
it was Dennis Winslow,
he was the
Wintech.
owner of WinTech.
You got it. And
Wow.
I came in for an interview and sat down across from him. And I had known him and his family for years because I pet sat and
Right.
did things like that. So sat down with him and he basically told me, slid a number across the table, and it was almost 30% less than what I was making at this big corporate cush job.
Mm-hmm.
And it was going to be an entry level, basically answering the phones at WinTech.
Right.
And I just remember my heart fell and I was like,
Oh,
oh, I can't do this. And Dennis said to me, if you trust me, I think you could run this place one day. And it was just kind of a funny, I remember
wow.
thinking, okay, well, I like the autonomy idea. I like the independence. This is something new and different. So
Mm-hmm.
the rest is history. 17 years later, I'm here as a co-owner. So
Wow. What a cool story. So when he said that, you do you think to yourself, well, I can temporarily take a cut in pay because I can see the future of where this might go someday.
yes, yes. And I think even as however old I was, early 20 something, even then I thought my priority, I mean, yes, in some degrees, my husband will tell you I have expensive taste, but money, it was not going to be the ultimate driver. And
Right.
so I was really attracted to the notion that I could make a big splash in a small pond.
Yeah. So what a cool story. I've never heard a story quite like that. So tell me, what did WinTech look like when you joined it? Size, approximate, type of business, clients, employees, things like that.
So WinTech has been around for 35 years,
Okay.
maybe 36 at this point. But they started off as a tool and die shop. We are about 7 miles from Lockheed Martin Marietta.
Mm,
And so a lot of the initial aerospace conversations happened with engineers who were on their way home on a Friday and, would leave the office at 2 o'clock, swing by WinTech for a hole in a wrench and kind of, go home early.
yeah.
And so one thing led to another, and we became known as kind of a custom job shop that, as Lockheed wound down a lot of its on-site machine shop capabilities,
Okay.
it began to outsource to WinTech. So by the time I came on board, we had just migrated from ISO 9001 to AS 9100.
Okay.
Like it was basically the month I started was our audit into AS 9100. So I was
Mm,
thrown to the wolves
okay.
on that. We had about 30 or so employees.
Okay.
Since grown, I think at our highest point, we were right at 47, 48 employees. We're a few below that now, trying to work our way back up, as I
Yeah.
know a lot of other manufacturers are. So
Sure. Post COVID and all whatever else.
all that
Yeah,
crazy.
various
Yeah.
economy things. And
Yep.
pretty much exclusively aerospace defense or defense related aerospace work, or
About 80% aerospace defense.
okay.
We do we've got a few production runs on some part numbers that we feel we are either a sole source or one of few sources.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of those are parts that we're really proud of. And then there are some onesie twosie prototype kind of things that we do here and there. And then we do a lot of spare parts for different aerospace companies. So we're a little bit all over the place. We're still, I think, at our soul, we are still a job shop. We're still kind of that, the nimble, somebody walks in and says, oh my gosh, I need this part right now. There's a plane that's down,
Right.
And until we get this, we can't put it back up in the air. We kind of, I think at our soul, that's who we are.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. And what types of machining do you kind of specialize in terms of types of equipment or processes?
We are machining primarily mills, lathes, grinders, things like that. But we also have a fabrication part of our shop.
Okay.
So we're kind of an all-in-one, do a lot of assembly work as well. We primarily Haas machines, some Mazak, a little bit of everything. So It's just kind of, as I'm sure with a lot of job shops, it's, it's whatever machine we got in 8 years ago, 12 years ago, whatever. Sure. And as long as it's running, it's going to stay on the shop floor.
You bet. Keep making chips with it.
Yep.
And so what was your journey like going from answering phones to being co-owner?
So it's kind of comical. I started answering the phones and I had this tiny little cubby hole of an office that is now our server room.
Okay.
No window. So the joke was Dennis had hung a picture of a window on the wall. So that was kind of fun. So I started essentially just answering the phones, doing some admin work, assisting the CFO at the time, doing things like learning how to read blueprints to help with purchasing. Mm-hmm. And then that migrated into helping with quotes and helping with orders. And then one day Dennis called me in his office and handed me a VHS tape and said, this is lean manufacturing. Your homework is to go home and learn it. And I'm like, okay. So I went home and found a VCR and watched it, and it was on lean manufacturing. And I came back and he said, all right, you are now going to be leading a project on the shop floor to come up with a collet holder for the manual mill department to help with efficiency. And I remember thinking, this is way out of my wheelhouse. Like, I don't know where to start. And I remember the 3 machinists that were tasked under my wings, and I credit them to this day. I could have sank or swam, and they were so kind to me. I mean, looking back on it, you had these seasoned machinists, these journeyman machinists that could have rolled their eyes at this 23-year-old who didn't know what she was doing, who all of a sudden was their temporary boss over a project,
right?
Because of nepotism, because the owner just happens to know this neighbor girl, But they were so kind, they were so patient. We ended up coming up with this very cool Christmas tree looking collet holder that's still used to this day, and so I credit them to a lot of me sticking around.
What a great story. Was that the culture at the time? Was it a pretty accepting, welcoming, friendly kind of culture?
It was. There's, I hear a lot in manufacturing. I hear about people holding a lot of knowledge close to the chest, close to the vest, and not necessarily wanting to train, the next generation because they're worried about their jobs and things like that. That's not been the feeling at Wintech. I think our machinists have all, they're always willing to teach somebody something. It's just a matter of, their own way of teaching it, or their own way of realizing whether or not the newbie wants to learn, I think is more of the challenge than it is sharing the info.
Yeah. Was that something that Dennis fostered from the beginning, do you think?
There was always a lot of accountability, individual accountability in what people do out on the shop floor. And I think it comes with Wintech, and it also comes with being a small business. You can't hide when you're one of 40 people. Right. It's much harder to hide. So I think that it's always been if you can't pull your own weight and then some, then you're not a good fit for Wintech. There aren't many people that are gonna do your job and their own at Wintech, and it'd be okay for a long period of time.
Right. Yeah. Well, even a 40-person shop, I know firsthand experience can be very protective and, tribal knowledge, and I'm not sharing. And so something was happening with Dennis and the culture and the way he led the company in the early years that led to that more openness. So that's, have you ever get involved with other companies, tours or talks with other owners to the level where you have some insight as to any differences between your shop and others in that regard?
I've noticed recently in the past 2 or 3 years, really, there's been a lot more willingness to share information between shops. I mean, I remember just 10 years ago reaching out to a few of my competitors and wanting to talk to them about some workforce development, thinking that, hey, if we've got, if the pie is so big and we're all fighting over 10% of it, if the pie was bigger, that 10% is bigger slice. Yeah. So let's go after the pie. And I remember there was a little bit of hesitancy there. But it wasn't until recently I reached out to that same group of competitors thinking, only a couple had gotten back to me that first go round. But the next go round, I said, all right, we're going to reach out to them because we were having a lot of grief with some approved processing houses. Mm-hmm. And so reached out to my local competitors and said, do you want to go to bat? Let's all go to our shared prime and share some grief and challenges that we're having and see if we can't come up with a fix altogether. Mm-hmm. And I remember being floored because it was on that phone call that people were readily offering information that I don't know that they would have done 10 years ago. Mm. So it was refreshing. It was also kind of scary because it's like, wow, what kind of position are we all in where we all feel okay about this now? But sure. I don't know. It's a good thing, I suppose.
Do you think that's just a shift in the industry about understanding that collaboration is the answer, and kind of all in this together?
I think so. I think it's a mix of things. I think that is a big portion of it. I think it's also the changing of the old guard. Mm-hmm. So I love Dennis. Dennis Winslow is a second dad to me. Mm-hmm. But there is also that mentality, I think, of that generation where it was feast or famine. Okay. And, you had to play your cards close to the vest because you had people snipe and help. You had people, looking, stealing work, things like that. But now I think that there's so much work out there, that there's so much to go around that I don't know that there's so much of the protection that there once was. And I think that the next generation recognizes that, hey, that the rising tide lifts all boats here.
Mm-hmm. So are these people that have been, so open, are they the next generation from the people that 10 years ago were running the show?
A couple of them are. A couple of the more outspoken people are. Uh-huh. There are a couple that are part of the old guard, but they've always been known not to be, not to be so secretive.
Got it. Well, that's encouraging. That's cool. That's very cool. So, so continue the story, if you will. You did the Lean project. You took on some more stuff. At what point did this ownership track really become solidified as the thing? And what happened?
So in about, I think probably, 7 or 8 years into me working at WinTech, I became office manager. And at that point, pretty much had understood everything there was to know about the office, running the office portion. Dennis kind of started teaching me a little bit more about the financial piece and what it takes to run from that aspect. And then a few years after that, I thought, okay, if I'm going to have any sort of credibility with the shop floor, and heck, the rest of the employees, I need to not walk around with an undergraduate degree in psychology and criminal justice. So I went to Georgia Tech for a master's in manufacturing. And that was a fun journey because it was, I had to talk my way into that because they looked at my transcript and said, but you haven't had calculus. And I said, I'll figure it out. Thinking, okay. So sure enough, it was a fun journey, and it was several other manufacturers in this professional program. So after I graduated with the manufacturing master's, I felt like I had a little bit more legitimacy, I guess, if you want to call it that. Yep. Where I at least could use the right terminology along the way. They still don't trust me to run parts, but that's fine. But yeah, so I did that. And then in 2018, my now business partner, John Hudson, has been at WinTech for 30 something years. Okay. And he started off sweeping the floor. Wow. And when he came into WinTech as an 18-year-old, he sat down across from Dennis, and Dennis said, "Where do you see yourself in 20 years?" And John pointed to Dennis's chair and said, "Sitting there." So It's kind of comical how all this has come together. So So John had known everything there was to know on that shop floor. So while I was learning everything there was to know about the business side and the operations, it was John learning every single machine out there, how to quote work. In 2018, he and I went into Dennis's office with a list of things, almost like the list of grievances, right? And we said, okay, these are things that he and I have noticed over the course of a few months that we want changed at Wintech. And Dennis kind of sat back in his chair and kind of did his little side smile. And he said, you guys think this is easy, don't you? And we said, no, we didn't say that. We didn't say that. And he said, okay, how about this? Starting on Monday, it was in November in 2018. He said, starting on Monday, you will run this company and I will take a step back and I'm going to check in with you once a week and I'll sign checks, see how things are going. And if after a year you like it, then we'll talk about you buying it from me. And we said, okay, we could deal with that. So sure enough, that Monday, John and I picked up and ran with it. And next thing you knew, it was November of 2019 was the end. It was December 2019. And of course, you're 3 months away from the world shutting down.
Yes.
And so we're like December of 2019, we're like, heck yeah, let's do this. And we started talking and started doing business valuation, having those kind of conversations. What does this look like? Next thing you know, the world shuts down in March. John and I are like, are we still doing this? Are we going to, run with it? He's like, it's now or never, right? I mean, this is an opportunity. And then October 1st, 2020, John and I signed the final paperwork to co-own the business.
Wow. That's such a cool story. It's amazing that Dennis would do that. Like on Monday morning, we're going to start you running the place.
Yep. I think deep down, he probably knew it was kind of already happening.
Right.
And this was kind of his way to test the waters. And he was, there. It was like training wheels in a way. So we were there that if something did happen, he was acutely aware of things, red flags and such, where if things weren't going well enough, then he could at least say, okay, then I'm going to look for an external buyer or whatever.
Right. So what was that like for the team? Did you sit the whole team down and say like, all right, instead of coming to me for answers, you go to these two for answers?
Pretty much. We had a shop-wide meeting that next Monday, and he stood up and said, here's what's going on. And I don't think anybody was floored because there was already so much that was funneling to John and I,
right?
That it was really just Dennis was the ultimate authority. But for the sake of this, then it just turned into, okay, there's no more Dennis in that equation. There's the final sign off is John and I. So, every once in a while we're a great match. We're a great pair. I'm super lucky because every once in a while, he'll pop his head into my office and say, we are either really stupid or just crazy because we bought a business during a pandemic.
Sure. And even despite the pandemic, someone either has to be crazy or stupid to buy a machine shop.
Oh my gosh, you got that right. 100%.
It's the hardest
100%.
business in the world, bar none.
Full
stop.
What the heck?
Yeah, I always say, in a shop like this, you get like 1,000 chances to get a job wrong and 1 chance to get it right. Like the stars truly have to align to like make to make the margin you quoted on it. Like, the material has to be good, and the cutting tools and the machine, and you can't scrap a bunch, and the schedule, and just like a million tiny details.
Bingo. Yeah, that's a perfect way of putting it.
Yeah. And it's not like it's easy to have all those stars align. It requires so much expertise and so much nuance of cutting tools and tool paths and work holding and flow downs and tolerances and all the things, right?
Yep. And then, oh, by the way, you have it just about done and you find out, oh, wait, there's a new revision nobody told you about.
For sure.
Personal favorite.
Wow, what a story. Do you mind sharing how you even valued the company? Was it a multiple of EBITDA or anything?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny how it worked. Initially, Dennis had a business colleague that he knew valued businesses, helped to evaluate business. And so he came in, talked to Dennis, did some calculations, gave Dennis the numbers. Dennis shared them with us, and John and I laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed and said, there's no way on God's green earth that the business is worth that. It was way too high. And
Okay.
so we did some kind of questioning, and we learned that there were projections built into that valuation. So we kind of had to backtrack and explain that a lot of those projections were not slam dunks. They
Right.
were not guaranteed. So we pulled back, and then the gentleman went back and he did some recalculations, and then came back, and then Dennis laughed. Dennis said, "There's no way on God's green earth that it's worth that low."
Oh my
So at
gosh.
that point, it's a unique relationship that we had, and we
Yeah.
still have, because I mean, Dennis, he walked down the aisle at my wedding right before my grandparents did. So
Oh
I
wow.
mean, there's such a closeness there that John nor I were looking to pull one over on him.
Sure.
You know, this is his baby. This is an
Yeah.
emotional thing.
Absolutely.
So at that point, we took those two numbers and we averaged them. That's essentially where we ended up.
Wow.
We recognized that, perhaps John and I overpaid a little, but the opportunity that we had with owner financing
Right.
and kind of having, this drop into our lap, it was one of those things that it's like, if we don't take them up on this, I think we'd forever regret it.
Yeah.
I think it was just so much of a plug and play. We were already doing the work, we were already doing it. Now let's provide Dennis the opportunity to retire, and earn what he has rightfully earned.
Yeah.
And it's fun. Every once in a while we'll still see him. He'll stop by to say hello.
Okay.
We joke that he has to sign the visitor log now, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
So.
And how long is that buyout for the owner financing? Is that still going on for many more years?
It's still going on. Yeah. For several more years. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but that's okay. I mean, we
it's
joke all the time.
It's manageable to send that check and still have enough to.
What day? Depends on the day you're asking.
Yeah.
Depends on the day. I mean, when you have a really big order that is supposed to go out and then it doesn't, and then the next day you're supposed to go out and then it doesn't, you start looking at the cash flow and you're like, if it doesn't go out on this date, then I can't guarantee that the money comes in on this date, and then I can't guarantee that I can pay this bill. And that, I mean, it's all those cash flow challenges. So it's the stuff that keeps me up at night, but it's also forcing John and I think, to get creative. So we're having to think differently when we're quoting jobs. And if there's a very large job that, John's kind of struggling whether or not he even wants, he'll add a lot of program management costs to it. And then we'll also negotiate with the customer and say, look, one of the hangups on this is that there's a ton of material that has to be purchased. If you will do a progress payment to help pay that, right when we buy it,
sure.
then this is doable. And that's helped to alleviate some of the cash flow challenges. So I'm hoping that we can keep doing that, because word on the street, at least from our customers, is that we're not the only ones asking for that kind of thing.
Oh, I'm sure.
So that's a good sign.
Yeah. Well, credit's gotten way more expensive. I'm sure loans or lines of credit are way more expensive than they were a few years ago. And do you, in the industry that you're in with the clients that you serve, have they been pushing out just crazy payment terms? I know some of the commercial aerospace, they're like net 120. That's where they're leading with.
I have heard horror stories. Our customers, knock on wood, have not been pushing. I mean, they're generally either net 15 or net 30.
That's amazing.
So that's definitely a keeper.
Yeah.
Definitely a plus. We have some that insist in being kept on credit card terms.
Oh, wow.
So they do a lot of P card transactions.
Right. Sure.
Which of course then you have to play with, do you charge them the credit card fees,
Yeah, of course.
But again, the time value of money, the option to be able to bill for something the moment it leaves your dock.
Yeah.
There's value to that.
Absolutely. Huh. Well, I'm glad that's not been a painful one for you, because I just came from an aerospace conference last week, and I know for some shops it's just killing them. It's absolutely.
I have heard horror stories. We had a commercial aviation company visit us a couple weeks ago and talk about looking for a speed shop, and looking for a quick turn, So we had a conversation with them, and that was one of the ththings I asked was, what generally are the terms? And they said net 60, and I went, of course it's all part of the game, right? So then I said, well, we do net 15. And he was like, well, what about net 30? And I was like, I'd be willing to talk about net 30.
Okay. Yeah.
Whatever. It's all part of the game, the dance.
Well, that was actually a question that I actually got up and asked one of the analysts that were speaking. I'm like, are they concerned about, shops in the commercial aerospace sector saying, screw it, I'm out of here because I'm getting 15 or 30 over at this other industry, and there's so much supply and we're so much demand and little supply that it's like they can just choose.
Yeah.
I'm choosing to work with clients that have good terms and also pay on those terms because,
yes,
the 120, it's
yes.
like, that's what's on paper. And it's like after receipt of, after they're past receiving inspection, so that might take a couple weeks.
Yes.
So now you're at 150, and it's like, that's half a year, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. There was something that happened to us kind of recently where we had it was a new customer, a new aerospace customer. We were given a purchase order and it had a total of 16 parts on one line item. And we were told they needed a first article. Well, of course, that wasn't quoted. You wanted 16 pieces. So they said, we just want the one piece first. So we said, okay, fine. And we did that. We sent the part, lost our shirts, sent the part.
Sure.
And then they said, okay, don't give us the other 15 until this is cleared. And we said, well, wait, time out. You wanted 16. We're set up. We've run these parts.
Right.
And they said, well, they have to clear that first article. To this day, those parts were sent last July, or I'm sorry, the one piece was sent in July. They still haven't paid on the first piece.
Oh,
so
no.
We're sitting on the other pieces ready to go. They're done. I've invested the material, the labor, the processing. So I'm waiting for them to pay on that invoice, which would indicate approval of the first article. So then I can send these parts and bill for them. So, part of it's a learning curve. Part of it is maybe we didn't ask the right questions on the front end.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is it's just the nature of the giant, beast that is some of these aerospace companies. Yeah. So,
live and learn. Tough. Holy cow.
Yeah, right?
That is nuts. And then the opportunity always is they come back and they're like, oh, this one thing is out by a 10th. So it's not, and
Bingo.
And you're like, but our CMM says it's fine.
Right.
And you're back and forth for weeks or months,
I'm holding my breath. I'm told any day now it's going to be approved any day.
Oh, man. This goes right into are we crazy to do this? Because these are the challenges, right?
And you try to, as a small business, you try to figure out, what do I have the authority to push, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, to this particular customer, I don't want to be a jerk because they've put some more work in here that so far so good. But do I push back and say, by the way, interest is accruing?
Right.
And see if they pay it, and see,
right.
But am I going to become a problem vendor? Am I going to become a supplier that they don't want to work with?
Yeah.
So there's a dance definitely that I think has to be done.
Yeah. I think you're naming the exact thing that all these shops deal with all the time. And I see it in forums. They're like, what do I do? I have this bill out or these bills and these clients won't pay. Like, how much of a pain in the ass do you decide to be? For fear of getting paid or not getting paid, but losing the client and developing a bad relationship. Any guidance, any pearls of wisdom for how to navigate that?
I think there are a couple pieces. I tend to write emails when I'm passionate about something. But what I need to do is, and what I've started doing a little bit better than usual, is saving the email and sending it the next day. So when I notice that something is overdue, or when I'm frustrated about a non-payment or a non-answer on something, I'll type the email, save it, come back the next day, reread it. And they always say that you need to be 10 times nicer in an email than you think you're being.
Yes.
Because of the intent that is read, of how it's read.
Exactly.
So, I try to do that. I try to, ingratiate myself to the buyer or the person that is ultimately in charge of sending the approval for an invoice.
Right.
And I think just recognizing that buyers and the people that are giving us orders, they're just as stressed out as we are. Even if they're not having to make payroll, they're stressed out for their own reasons.
Yeah.
And I think if you can kind of humanize the other side and recognize, look, we're all short-staffed. We're all doing more than we signed up to do. So maybe the non-payment of an invoice truly is an oversight. Maybe it's the U.S. Postal Service. Okay, so that's
Sure.
likely.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's both insightful and some great tactical advice. I know I've done that. I've like saved a draft and I come back and I'm like, oh, I need to flower this thing up a little bit. Like, good morning. How are you doing? Hope you had a great weekend,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
whatever, just because, yeah, it can come across very differently than, there's no intonation in emails, right? Unless you add
No.
these sweet adjectives and then it comes
Right.
across
Lots of
nicer. So
exclamation points. Yeah, yeah.
all caps, all caps.
Yeah. Emojis. Right.
Oh, so good. So has the company just grown over the years, just organically, just those clients have grown bigger and bigger, or have you strategically gone out and done sales and targeted different companies to work with them?
Essentially, it's been a lot of word of mouth from engineers.
Okay.
As they move from company to company, they kind of take us with them.
Yep.
I mean, Lockheed Martin Marietta, we started doing business with them in 1989 or 88.
Okay.
And now we do business with like 12 different divisions of Lockheed.
Wow.
So I think that there is a lot of potential. In fact, John Hudson, my business partner right now, is out at an industry event right now for F-35.
Oh,
And so
nice.
there's a lot of conversations happening with them. And I think I just saw in the news that Spain is poised to buy several F-35s. So
Okay.
I'm sure that the powers that be are holding their breath on that one.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a lot of accidental growth in a good way, but we're seeing so much. We're seeing heavy quoting activity really ramp up, and not that it ever got slow for us, but it's really it's gotten pretty busy with our existing customers, and it's also started expanding with some new customers that we've noticed are, again, either engineers from past clients or come word of mouth. So we do some social media marketing and little minor things like that, but it's very rarely for the intent to go get orders and
Hmm.
more just to keep the brand in general out there
Yeah.
is essentially what that does.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. I remember many times where engineers or even buyers as well would switch a company and then we'd get a call from them a few weeks or months later. They're like, hey, we have this need and our current supply base doesn't have capacity or isn't great or whatever. So it's always nice when people call you out of the blue from somewhere new.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, do you feel like I imagine it sounds like Lockheed is a pretty large percentage of your business, and there's some risk from client concentration. But I'm guessing with 12 different divisions from probably all over the country or the world, there's some safety in that because even if this defense arm is slow or whatever, this other program is going great guns. Is that how you think about that?
Yep, that's exactly it. Yeah, it's funny because on paper when you look at our list of customers, I was just looking at 2023, we did work for 71 different entities last
Wow,
year.
that's a lot.
So there's I think a good diversity of clients.
Hmm.
It is funny, you can always tell, you can overlap what's happening on the world stage with a lot of it. Because,
Sure.
the more somebody in North Korea runs their mouth, then the more, the friendly countries get a little nervous and start placing orders with the US government. So,
Yeah.
yeah, there's always, you can see correlations, but
Hmm.
ultimately, I think with that diversity of clientele, I think we're in a good position not to rely on any one thing from happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, speaking of markets and serving different clients, I imagine your AS9100 has been a critical part of your success for many years now. I know as I hear people talk on LinkedIn or various forums or places, there's questions of should we go ahead and do this? Should we get a certification because we don't today, and it's expensive and it's time consuming. And my advice is, it's pretty essential these days if you're going to serve any kind of high value market. That's not just really sort of relatively low margin, low hourly rate work. It's just pretty essential to get these certifications. Do you have any different advice?
No, I agree. I think it's no longer a like nice to have.
Mhm.
It really is. probably the single barrier to entry for anyone looking to get into aerospace that's not already in it.
Right. Yeah.
I remember when ISO was just kind of starting to be you need to be ISO 9001. What did they call it? Not certified, compliant, right? And it was kind of like not necessarily certified, just compliant. And then it turned into, you need to be certified. And then it turned into, by the way, you also need to be AS 9100, not just 9001, but the next one.
Right.
So.
Yeah. All right. Let's get into the topic that I know we're waiting to get into. Speaking of compliance versus certified, for years now, there's been the NIST standard, NIST 800-171, which any shop like yours is supposed to have been compliant with since 2016?
2017.
2017.
Yep, you got it.
And it wasn't happening, and people didn't even know what it was, yet it was on their POs, and lots of sensitive data was getting stolen from all sorts of companies, big and small, and hence CMMC is now looming large. I know that you are a thought leader in this space around that. Can you share, I guess, what you've been doing and some of your perspectives on the requirements?
Sure. Yeah, so if you are in aerospace at all, likely you've had the DFARS, I believe it's 252-204-7012 clause. And that 7012 clause is essentially the safeguarding of confidential, unclassified information, of sensitive data. Mm-hmm. And buried in the DFARS clause is reference to NIST 800-171. And it's a standard that talks about protecting the confidentiality of CUI, which is confidential unclassified information. So yeah, it's funny because as a small business owner, we get these purchase orders or these contracts. Some people, if they're primes, they're going to get a contract. If you're a subcontractor, you will likely get a purchase order. It's mincing words, but I like to call out it's not necessarily a contract. It's a purchase order that, somebody in legal might tell you it's a contract. So the purchase order has all these flow downs, and it might say you need to be AS 9100. Okay, check that box. And then it might also say, and Acme Aerospace also has these other terms and conditions, and you need to go to this website to go find them. Okay, well, let's say you got a fax, and let's say that purchase order came through fax. It's not something easily hyperlinked where you can click on it, right? So now you got to go to the computer, type that URL in, and go to it, and hope that URL is good, because half the time it's a bad URL. Yep. So you go to the URL and you see all these flow downs, and one of them just happens to be maybe this DFARS 7012. And you then click on that one, and you've got all these different onion layers you're peeling back. And it's almost comical because you could get a purchase order that's 47 pages long because of all these flow downs, and it's for a $1,200 bracket.
Right. And
you're sitting here going, why on God's green earth, why am I doing this for a bracket? So the idea, kind of one of my theories, is essentially this is just flowed down just as a CYA for lack of better way of saying it, but it's when a buyer has said, okay, well, it's in my purchase order, so if I'm going to have Wintech do this bracket, surely they're going to have to follow all the things I got to follow. Copy, paste, there you go. Yeah. And then from there, if that prime got that flowed from the U.S. government, surely that buyer or that contracting officer says, here's this giant assembly to a fighter jet. And all these flow downs apply to my big old prime that has a lot of money and a lot of resources. So I'm putting all this stuff in there. They need to safeguard this data. And now here we are all the way at the bottom of the hill as Wintech, and we're having to attest that we are doing all these things. Now, the frustrating part is we should have all been speaking up, 7 years ago when all this stuff was first in. Right. But arguably, we were all incentivized by quality and delivery and price. Those were kind of the things we were beat in our heads, right? It was all about the quality of the product, all about delivering on time. It was all about making the budget. It was never, ever about also securing the data. There was no incentive to that. So now if you look at purchase orders, you've also got other DFARS clauses. Well, what else aren't we doing, right? I think there's -7007 DFARS clause. Make sure you have a human trafficking policy. What machine shop honestly has a human trafficking policy?
Right.
So I think that we kind of lose the forest through the trees when we get too hung up on the fact that these are things that these are all of these minutia that we all have to be doing. And ultimately, yes, it's safeguarding data is something we should be doing, but it's also not. We shouldn't be doing it to the detriment of everything else in our shop.
Sure.
So I think there's a lot to CMMC, which is ultimately just the assessment process overlay to making sure you're doing NIST 800-171, you're compliant with it. I think there's a lot of good with it. I don't think it's the right answer to the world's problems, but I think it's an answer that we're all going to have to deal with if we want to play in this space.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, as far as WinTech's concerned, it's been a slow go. It's been several years journey to kind of get to a place that I can sleep better at night.
Were you guys paying attention to that 7012 and the NIST years before?
So it's funny, right as soon as it came out was around the time that I was starting to learn purchase orders. And so I remember walking into Dennis's office, and it was a really long purchase order. I remember exactly the part that it was for. And I showed him and I said, "What's all this stuff mean?" And he flipped through it and he was like, "Oh, this is stuff that's always on there." And I said, "Well, but this says," and it had a oh gosh, like a December date on it or something. Like I felt like it was a date coming up. And I said, "Is this something we have to be certified for?" And he's like, No, let's just go in and get it set up." So the months that happened after that, I started digging deeper and realizing, it has a lot to do with cybersecurity. Well, my husband was in IT, so of course I take that number back home and I'm like, "What does all this mean?" And he's like, "You guys aren't doing this. You need to do this." So he came in on weekends and helped us get to where we needed to be. That was kind of, in hindsight, it's like, man, we had a lot of free labor.
Right.
But we got to a much better point very, very quickly in the grand scheme of things. But it wasn't until I brought on an MSP about 3 or 4 years ago that we really kind of buttoned up all the loose ends, all the kind of holes. But it was to hear government folks, and I've got a lot of friends in industry and Department of Defense, that they're working their tails off. And they're just back to our conversation about buyers and stuff.
Sure.
Everybody's the other side of the table. Often they're more like you than you want to admit. But it's frustrating to hear some of them talk about how easy this is and how chastising small businesses. They should have been doing this all along. Should have been. No. We were supposed to be getting you quality parts to make sure that they were going to be put on planes to keep warfighters safe.
Right.
That's what we were supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Nobody explicitly said to us, by the way, this is also just as important.
Yeah, because if starting whatever back in 2017, if you'd said, "No, I'm sorry, I can't quote on this because we can't meet the thing you said we have to meet," or here's my price because I have to do all these things, they would have been like, "Well, no, I'm not going to pay you that much or wait that long." So they would have given it to someone else that wasn't doing those things, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Wow. And I think the kind of crazy piece that complicates it is that when it's all said and done, they talk about CMMC compliance and how you're going to have to be certified at time of award. This is eventually, right? There's a proposed at the timing of this recording right now, the proposed rule is out and will theoretically become a final rule for it to be put in contracts either late this year or early 2025. And if and when that happens, the idea will be that you have to have a certification at time of award. Right. Well, if we're concerned about data and data sharing, why are we concerned about it at time of award and not time of quote?
Yeah, sure.
Because if you have to get the data in order to quote, then, so you're saying I don't have to be certified to accept the data for a quote, but I have to be certified to accept the data to make the job. So there's, to me, again, losing the forest through the trees, I think if the whole purpose of this is to safeguard national data and information, I personally think we've gone about it completely wrong.
Yeah, right. So for those that, that maybe aren't as in tune with it, There's this C3PAO network that's going to be going out and doing the actual certifications. There's not nearly enough of them today. There's more being trained and added. But what do you think is the most likely outcome when the rule does become law? Are there going to be lots of waivers and exceptions or are they going to be firm about it? Like, yeah, what do you think is going to happen? And there's, people are going to get in line for an audit and they'll be like, oh yeah, we'll get to you in 2026.
Right.
It's like, but I can't run my business without purchase orders. So,
right.
Yeah, what's going to happen?
There's a conversation I had with someone recently that he brought up a good point. He said, all this is fine and dandy until a general on the battlefield picks up the phone and says, are you telling me I can't have my widget because somebody doesn't have a piece of paper? Mm-hmm. And I think it will come down to the actual people using the products that we're manufacturing, the people that are going to say, I don't care what has to be done. I need, such and such part. Personally, if I were made president tomorrow and I'm in charge, the first thing I would do is kind of draw a line in the sand. Like as fatalist as it sounds, can we all agree that the stuff out on our networks right now, if it is confidential, unclassified information, can we just make the assumption that it has been breached? It's a crappy way of looking at things, but let's just make that assumption. Now, moving forward, anything new developed, anything that isn't already out in the wilderness, then that becomes what we're standing on. That becomes what gets put in contracts. Right. Otherwise, I just feel like there's all this murkiness and there's this, sure. I mean, we get assembly prints a lot when we're just making a component. And I hear people argue, well, we need to stop oversharing CUI. Primes need to start separating things out. And if WinTech is just going to make the bracket and not the full assembly, WinTech just needs to see the bracket. In those cases, then you might have to completely redevelop the print, because anyone right. that's worked in a machine shop knows that bracket might be on page 7, but the notes for the processing and the tolerances and the bill of materials is on page 1. So, we can talk a good game about how too much CUI is shared, but as a manufacturer, I don't want less CUI. I want to know context. I want to know form, fit, function. Mm-hmm. I want to know what is it that you want me to make. So I don't know. I a lot of times with some of our government partners and some of the larger primes, I wish that small business were invited into the room a little bit more frequently, because we can share some of these very unique situations and contextual challenges for them to be able to make better decisions.
Yeah, because it would potentially change the entire conversation or the answer about how to roll something out. Right? Mm-hmm. It's completely unrealistic or totally realistic.
Right.
I want to ask you about a couple of specific things that I don't know the answers to, but I've heard discussed. Let's talk about CUI marking. A hot topic, if I've ever heard one. I've heard that the drawings and models and things are supposed to have the person's name and phone number of who generated the CUI. If it's an engineer in the drafting department or whatever, they're supposed to put their contact. Is that true?
So I don't know about that. I do know that NARA ultimately oversees the CUI program. National. You're going to ask me what that stands for, and I don't know it. Don't know what it stands for.
Okay.
But that's where all the CUI registry, that's where all the information about CUIs. Now, the problem is a lot of times, my personal experience from the CUI markings feel as though the data that I have, the hard copy data, whether it's prints or electronic data too, model files, whatever, the prints, the 2D PDFs or the TIFF files or the scanned in plotter prints, that stuff was created before some of these CUI rules.
Yeah.
So to think that someone in the government is going to go back and mark these things properly and then make sure that the updated versions get sent to anyone who has, talk about controlled documents, right? Mm-hmm. I think that there was someone in a prime that said to me a few years ago that CMMC is built on a house of cards, and that house of cards is CUI.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's right, because if all of this is reliant on CUI and data that we don't know what it is, we don't know how to market, we don't know who's responsible for marketing it.
Mm-hmm.
We are a design exempt shop. We don't do any in-house design.
Right.
So does that mean that any data we get needs to already be marked CUI? And does that mean that if we create a model file for a handful of the features on a mill, in my head, that's not CUI? I know you and I were talking, and you've heard the opposite. You've heard, well, it could be CUI.
Sure.
So I think that the way that we are running things, the way that we're looking at things, is we're letting things like ITAR and export control, we're letting that kind of drive what we're doing. And in a lot of cases, we overscope. In a lot of cases, we just automatically assume, okay, it's CUI.
Right.
And I hate doing that. But
Sure.
in my environment, it's easier to do that than it is for me to nitpick and say, okay, that doesn't need to be protected. That does. That doesn't. Right. That does.
Well, aren't there some requirements or regulations that you can't mark something CUI that's not CUI?
Well, yeah, and that's yeah. Thankfully, like I said, we don't mark anything. We don't.
Sure.
We treat things like they are sensitive, and that's about it. Again, I don't envy medium-sized companies, because if you think about it, the small companies, we're able to be nimble, and we're able to kind of, wrap our hands around some of these things. The big companies, they have the resources and the dollars to make things happen. The medium companies, if you've got 490 people and a bunch of them are remote, and you design and you do software,
sure. Right.
Oh gosh, yeah, no thank you.
Yeah,
they've got their work cut out for them.
So challenging. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so if and when, I guess we kind of covered it, a general at some point is going to say, I need my parts, screw the requirements. My planes can't fly or my tanks can't drive. But practically speaking, until that happens or whatnot, do you think it's prudent for shops to, can you get in line for an assessment yet?
Well, that's the kicker, is you can get in line for a JSVA, a joint surveillance audit, a joint surveillance voluntary assessment. JSVA. You get in line for that, and it's basically where a C3PAO and a DIBCAC auditor come out and kind of tag team the audit, so to speak. But the downside is there's no guarantee that that's going to translate to a CMMC certificate. So personally, with the dollars that are out there that I hear waved around that assessments cost, I'm not willing to drop tens of thousands of dollars on a big maybe.
Right.
Not when it's not going to better my product,
Sure.
So I think that machine shops now, I think the best thing they can do for themselves is get compliant to 800-171, because no matter what happens, you've already been promising that. So you need to do that, to Rev 2, and then to be hyper aware of what's happening in the industry with NIST 800-171. So 800-171 just released a third revision. And the way that the DFARS clause reads right now, it implies the latest revision of 800-171.
Right.
So when Rev 3 becomes official, which I believe might be as soon as April, when Rev 3 becomes official, if you have a DFARS 7012 clause and it's just business as usual, you're now attesting that you're compliant with Rev 3. And Rev 3 is vastly more intense than Rev 2.
It? Oh, wow.
It is. So, and there's also a lot of unknowns with the Rev 3. So there are something called ODPs, organizational defined parameters. And those have been incorporated into the third revision. Essentially what it is it's allowing government agencies to define certain things for their own environments. So, for example, it may say the old NIST 800-171 Rev 2, it might say access control define who has access to certain privileges, certain things in your system, full stop. Rev 3 may have 10 different steps to that. And it may say, and you're going to review it X amount of months or periodically, but then it's DOD is going to be the one, or the agency is going to be the one to define that time period. So you have all these unknowns, and it's just like I said, it's a heck of a lot more involved than Rev 2. So my best advice to a machine shop in this space would be, if you right now are working on projects with DFAR 7012, watch NIST 800-171, and the day that Rev 3 becomes active, any purchase orders or any quotes that you deal with 7012 called out, just be explicit and explain to your buyer or your customer, hey, I'm accepting this order, but please note, we are Rev 2 compliant. I don't anticipate any pushback on that. Okay. That's our strategy. That's what we're going to be doing.
Yep.
And if our buyer or customer has a problem with that, then there's really nothing I'll be able to do at that point. So I would like to think that in the industry with machine shops, we do have a little bit of leverage, and that is the fact that if you are in the space and you're making parts, somebody needs you for something. Mm-hmm. They can go dual source something somewhere else, but there are only so many companies you can do that with. So
yeah. I have definitely heard of shops saying that even to get on RFQs, they're requiring to, show what their SPURS score is, or show progress towards, a higher score. Have you heard that? Have you seen that?
Yes. And that breaks my heart, because so a SPURS score, a supplier performance risk score, essentially it's your score for NIST 800-171. And you can have a score as low as -203 or as high as 110.
Right.
And the idea is to become perfect. Well, pro tip, don't go type in 110 if you've not actually assessed yourself, because that's a big old red flag. DIBCAC loves those 110s. They come knocking on your door. Right. But yeah, what I'm hearing is when customers, non-government customers, your primes or your other contractors are asking, hey, screenshot your SPRS score, I strongly advise you not to do that for a few reasons. One, if you screenshot a score and it's 99 out of 110, you've just admitted to not being 100% compliant. And right. Also, you're not giving someone context. They don't know what missing points you have. For all they know, it's something pretty dangerous to, you're missing something pretty integral to the system, or maybe not, maybe it's something minutia, maybe it's just the minutia. So I would say that if somebody does ask for an SPRS score, ask a question back, say, who needs the data? Are you willing to jump on a phone call where, I can walk you through what we've done, or I can share a screen, nothing stopping the other person from screenshotting, but still, you're kind of doing a little bit more due diligence and some of that, because a lot of people are just checking the box.
Mm-hmm. That's good advice. Yeah, it is a little bit insane, because it sure seems as though there will be plenty of companies that say this is just too much, I'm out. I don't need the expense of, unless it's so core, to your business, you couldn't not serve this industry. But if you have shops that are 10, 20% defense and the rest other commercial, I could easily make the decision to just get out of it entirely.
Yeah.
And the supply chain is already too small. There's not nearly enough suppliers. I hope that quality doesn't suffer for it, because I can almost see circumstances where a third tier supplier says, I'm not playing this game anymore because you're 10, 20, 30% of my business. And then for a contractor, a subcontractor to call them and say, but you've always chem filmed my parts. Mm-hmm. And then say, well, you can send me data, but redact the print. Mm-hmm. And so, you play around with the print, you take this off, you take this, and then God forbid you forget to mention something about masking of a hole, right. or something. And then next thing you know, you've got all these parts and it misses QC and it goes to paint and it ends up on a plane. And then there's FOD, then something right. gets flaked off. It's a little bit, I'm drawing, reaching for straws or whatever the term is, but it's kind of, you hate to see something suffer all for the benefit of something else. Mm-hmm. So you bring up a good point, and another question I guess I have for sub vendors, like a plating house. if they're getting that CUI, the drawings or the models, they should also be certified or compliant. But that's so seemingly so impractical. Like, are your shops like you going to just recreate your own basic drawing without? I mean, is that even a thing? Is that like, that's not CUI if you make your own version with the bare basics of just plot, this plating spec and mask these holes? Is that not CUI?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I mean, right now, as it stands, we're sending our suppliers encrypted data or sending us secure file share. And we have a lot of suppliers that push back on us because of it. We can't access that folder. And then you learn that because everybody's sharing an email address. It's like, oh my gosh, that's security 101. And I don't have an answer for that. I know that in the old days, and I'm putting quotes on that, in the old days, when we had certain parts that had to be masked, we took the print, a hard copy of the print, and we highlighted certain areas and we redacted areas, but not for the sake of security, but for the sake of making sure they focused on what we needed them to do and what we needed them to do only. Yep. And we got away from that because, for the same reason I was just telling you, is people were like, no, send me everything. I'm the processing house. I will determine what I need. I'm the professional. Sure. And they were right. So that's what we started doing.
Yeah. So many questions. Oh my gosh, just a can of worms, isn't it?
It is. And again, I don't know, as well-intentioned as our government partners are, I don't know that enough of them have the awareness that these things are real problems and these things are real. I think there's this notion that, small business just needs to get their act together. They just need to use MFA and, stop letting the bad guys do things by clicking on internet ads. It's like, that's not all of these things can be true.
Yeah, sure. So to kind of wrap up here, I think you've offered some really solid advice on the CMMC and security side. What other advice would you give to shops of any type, whether they're serving the defense space or oil and gas or medical or commercial aerospace, that can help ensure their success in this new market, in 2024?
I think best advice I could give to any shop, whether it's aerospace, commercial, medical, whatever you're working on, is get really good at the stuff that you're pretty good at now, and just become an expert in what you're trying to do. And I know that a lot of people try to be, everything to everyone, and it can be really tempting when there's so much meat out there. When you get all kinds of requests for quotes, it's tempting to just quote it all. I think that the best advice, though, is just to get really, really good at the stuff that you want to be really, really good at. And I think that's going to ultimately make you invaluable to your customers and to the market.
Mm-hmm. That comes right back to that old saying, the riches are in the niches, right? And I've got a number of guests who have very specific niches that they focus on, and they absolutely thrive and they do so well. And I know, back in my own shop days, there were absolutely times where we were a little light on work and we're like, this doesn't fit us great, but we'll take it. And it just killed us, right?
Yeah. You just got to make chips, right?
We learned over the years that no, you got to focus on our core competency and get really good at certain things. And it's a longer term approach, because when your machines are sitting idle, you're like, I just got to get something on those. But so it's yet another thing that makes it the hardest business in the world, because without a strong sales pressure, I call it, RFQs and opportunities, without enough volume of those that you can focus on the ones you're really good at, it's almost an impossible task to say, I'm not going to take these other jobs and just focus on what I'm really good at, to niche down and get excellent and invaluable for those things. No easy answers, but I appreciate the conversation today. I appreciate you sharing your story. What a fantastic, cool story of showing up as an early 20-something and eventually running the shop. Amazing. Just
kind of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Allison, if people wanted to reach out to you to learn more about WinTech, how would you suggest they do that?
Best way is to on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. So definitely find me. reach out, connect, leave me a note, and I'm much more likely to hit accept if I know what you're all about.
And we will make sure your profile is linked in the show notes, and your website and all that. So thank you again. I know I'm definitely going to be promoting this to people that are in the defense space and want to hear some good, candid advice and feedback and sort of state of the union, if you will, of what's going on, because it's just, there's so much out there that's confusing and people are overwhelmed and scared about what it's going to cost me. And so appreciate you sharing today.
It's daunting. Absolutely.
All right, Allison. We'll see you around. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Bye.